What up? Welcome back to another Malazan Book of the Fallen video. In this one, we're going to be setting the stage for Gardens of the Moon and trying to demystify that beginning. So the goal for this one is just to introduce those key players and geographies that you see, kind of take out some of the confusion, I think, because you do feel like you're in some ways thrown into the deep end. So we're going to talk about all those key players, the ones who become important later on, and just kind of all that background info that'll hopefully make Gardens of the Moon a bit of an easier read for you. So let's go. Okay, so diving into the key geographies and the key players, a couple things to keep in mind. There's a lot of different names being thrown out. This is all going to be new to you as you're diving in. So I think the key to keep in mind is that the vast majority of this story happens on a continent called Genabacus. This is one of the 15 continents that I talked about in my earlier video, and you can check out those video links up there. But it's a pretty big continent. So at the beginning, when we're in Genabacus, we start off in Pale. Then we move on to Darujhistan, which is where most of the book actually takes place. But we do get some action that happens up north on Genabacus. So in the Rivi Plains, in the Black Dog Forest, the Mott Forest, etc. Those are much more minor pieces. But for the most part, all you really need to know is that it takes place in Genabacus, which is a huge continent, and then within that, the two primary kind of city-states that we're seeing in the book, at least this early on, is Pale and Darujhistan. We do get some of the very early stages of the book that happen elsewhere. So Itko, which is on the continent of Kwantali, and that really just takes up a small fraction of the overall book. But as it turns out, well, those kind of very early events really set the stage and are important for the whole story as it progresses through. We also get a tiny bit in Malaz City right at the very beginning of the book, and that is obviously the island that the Empire takes its name from, and as we learn later on, where kind of the whole Empire got started about 100 years prior to the events of the main book in Gardens of the Moon. So I know there's a lot of different names being thrown around, continents and countries and city-states, etc. That really is kind of all you need to know on the geography, at least to be able to get started. That kind of just broad, zoomed-out view, if you can keep that straight, then you can kind of worry about all the finer details later on, and hopefully that makes it a little bit easier to understand kind of where you are and where these things are happening. There's also obviously a ton of different groups and players being introduced, but I think if you can keep them all grouped together kind of in those buckets of who they're related to, quote unquote, then it, I think, will make it a lot easier, and the names and stuff you'll become more familiar with and start remembering who the actual individuals are as we go on. So we're just going to go through who the main kind of buckets or groups of players are in Gardens of the Moon to hopefully help you guys keep it straight in your mind as you go through this first book. Number one, obviously, is the Malazan Empire, right? And that includes a whole host of characters and factions within there, and there's all kinds of internal political dynamics happening, but the main players are obviously the Empress Lacine, right, who is actually formerly known as Surly. She has been formerly the head of an elite unit called the Claw, which is kind of like an assassin slash spy slash mage unit in the Malazan Empire under the former emperor. Underneath Surly in the Malazan Empire, the actual Malazan army, and that is commanded by a guy named Dujek One Arm, one of my favorite characters. But and then you have all the kind of officer corps underneath the army, which includes people like Whiskey Jack, who is my favorite character probably in the book. I have a lot of, everyone's my favorite character, but couple of other people to note under that Imperial kind of high command. She also has her adjunct Lorne, which is basically like the equivalent of a second in command. She's not really a military commander, but also not really just a bureaucrat either. She kind of straddles and actually gets into some of the action. You also have a young officer underneath the Malazan army named Ganos Perrin, and he's a really cool character too, but he falls kind of underneath that main Imperial command structure as well. One of the other key components of the military faction or the army is a kind of sub-corps called the Bridge Burners, and this is one of these kind of already legendary units in the Malazan Empire, and one of the kind of groups that we also get exposure to very early on in Gardens of the Moon. They are like such a cool group of folks who pretty much carry all the way through all 16 or 10 or however you want to measure it if you want to include Esselmont's stuff. So they're a really cool group as well. Within all of that, it essentially boils down to, within the Malazan Empire, you have like the Imperial command structure, Lacine, adjunct Lorne, and then you've got the kind of mage core, right? Taishren, Nightchill, Acherones, Beludrin, etc. There's a lot of different high mages, and then you've got the actual army, which is headed up by Dujek One Arm, and then within that, you've got the kind of bridge burners, which includes people like, Whiskey Jack, Fiddler, all these like amazing characters who are just super fun to get to know. The next kind of group of folks that you come across in the book is from Pale, and there's not really much to say there. You do see a couple of the kind of Pale ruling class at some point, but that's really just, the whole Pale element is really just stage setting for the whole rest of the book, and to kind of create this feeling of intensity, and to also kind of lay out like the overarching consequences, right? Because all this stuff that we see going down is actually of tremendous consequence, and I think that Pale is introduced so early on just really to underscore and to show you how heavy this stuff is, right? We're talking about war and conquering, etc. And so not really much to say about Pale, but there are some Pale nobles who you can pretty much just ignore in terms of memorizing names and stuff like that. Not that critical. Then we come to Darujhistan, which is the kind of primary center of the story, at least in Gardens of the Moon, but also continues on later. And I would say that within Darujhistan, you really have kind of 3 to 4 different kind of groups or buckets within there. The first one is the Torud Cabal, and I have no idea if I'm slaughtering that name or not, but basically you can think of the Torud Cabal as just a kind of guild of mages, sorceresses, witches, etc., and that is headed up by the High Alchemist Baruch. There's also, other kind of mages within that who I don't know if they directly report or if it's a council. I think it's more of a council, but definitely one is kind of more equal than the others, that being High Alchemist Baruch. But there's also Mamat, who's a powerful mage in his own right. Next, you have the actual ruling class of Darujhistan itself, and so it's kind of governed by a council of kind of wealthy nobles, essentially, and that includes all kinds of different people. They're the kind of group of folks who, I think, at least for me, you love to hate, right? They seem kind of worthless and very self-absorbed and ego-driven, etc. And that includes kind of, Counselor Orr, and there's a bunch of different kind of individual politicians that are all like jockeying for position within that kind of Darujhistan ruling class. When you really scratch down under the surface, you find out that the Mage Guild, right, is actually calling most of the shots, but definitely an important group of people to know. The third and my most favorite is the folks at the Phoenix Inn, right? There's, a group of friends, including Ralik Nam, who's an assassin with the Assassins Guild. It seems like everybody in Darujhistan is part of a guild, right? A builder's guild, a blacksmith's guild, mage guild even. But so Ralik Nam is part of the Assassin's Guild, but he's also part of a group of friends who all kind of meet and boozes together, etc., and just hangs out at an inn called the Phoenix Inn. And that is a super fun place. Lots of different things happening. Kind of centered around the Phoenix Inn, but then you have his buddy Marulio, who's kind of like a Bravo in some ways. He's like a pretty sweet sword fighter. And then they have another friend called Cole, who's kind of the resident alcoholic. It seems like there's some history there that we'll find out down the road. And then there's Croup. And again, this is, I know I say this all the time, but Croup is one of my favorite characters. I think I have about 50 favorite characters, but Croup's this weird little fat bald dude who's, very kind of egotistical, but super funny. And he's kind of, you don't really know what his story is, but he's always there at the Phoenix Inn with the other three, and just a really funny guy. The other person who's kind of part of that Phoenix Inn contingent is Crocus Younghand. He's actually the nephew of one of the mages, Mamat, in the Torud Cabal, but also kind of frequents the Phoenix Inn and really kind of looks up to and idolizes like Marulio, Ralik Nam in particular. He's kind of friends with Croup too, and so that's kind of the main faction that you really kind of fall in love with in Darujhistan. The rest I would group just kind of into an other category. And this bucket really consists of like these legendary, almost godlike, almost mythological creatures, including people like Anomander Rake, who's like one of the biggest bad in fiction of all time. One of my favorite characters too. Kaladin Brood, who's like this big giant warlord who everybody is like scared of / respects. Kaladin Brood is with the Tistandi, which is kind of this jet black skinned elder race of people, and they've basically set themselves directly in opposition to the Malazan Empire. You also see Kalor, who's Kaladin Brood's like second in command. He is not a big giant, so they're not obviously related by blood, but he's kind of a legend in his own right and has a very deep history, which we're not really privy to, but it comes across that this dude is for real. Finally, we also get a lot of interaction with a group called the Talan Imas, and again, probably butchering that, but this is another elder race of basically like Walking Dead, right? Think of like walking skeletons come to life. Some of them are like more desiccated than others, but they're this kind of big deal elder race, a lot of history, who come in and they're actually in service to the Malazan Empire. So they're actually serving the throne, which at this point in time is obviously occupied by Lassine / Surly. The other kind of last group, if you will, that I would mention is that, even though they've been deposed / assassinated, what have you, the former emperor and his second in command still feature pretty prominently. So Kalenved and Dancer, who actually have a prequel of their own where you get to go back and hit the origin story. Again, I wouldn't do that until after you've read the main series, and I kind of laid out my reasons why, and I'll post a link to that video up there. But they also feature pretty prominently too. So those are the main characters and the kind of key geographies that you need to keep in mind. I think it really is as simple as knowing that, it's mostly on Genebacus, right? And there's mostly those kind of three primary groups, being the Malazan Empire and all the pieces underneath there, the Darujhistan contingent, and then these kind of other players who are either for or against the Malazan Empire. The other thing I would say is just that there's a lot of stuff that we aren't privy to and we're not supposed to be. So if you're getting confused, don't worry about it. Just, keep those 3 or 4 main factions in mind. You're still on Genebacus. It's still just a couple of key city-states where the action is taking place, and just kind of roll with it. So hopefully that helps you guys kind of simplify the dramatis personae there's a lot of moving parts, obviously, but I think if you kind of think about it in terms of the four main groups of people that we're seeing and interacting with in Gardens of the Moon, then it can kind of help you stay grounded and not get lost in all the various names and people and factions, etc. And so I'm curious to know, though, what did I miss? Who did I leave out? Who should I have introduced right now so that people have a better chance of not getting lost as they dive in? I'm excited to get this conversation going and look forward to seeing your comments. Hopefully you guys like the content and click that subscribe button to come along for the ride. Click that notification bell so you never miss a post. And most important, I think, is to give this video a thumbs up so that the YouTube gods will promote this video out there so that we get more readers in to get that conversation going. As always, for me, that's the main goal, is to kind of get the talking going so that I have somebody to nerd out with. So thank you guys so much for watching. Next week, we dive into the meat of Gardens of the Moon with the prologue and the first chapter, and I look forward to that. And until then, happy reading.